everybody, and welcome to the Ocean Impact Podcast. We have an incredible episode for you today, which will certainly make you think deeper and dive deeper than you've ever gone before when it comes to Planet Ocean. My name is Amelia Helt and I'll be one of your co-hosts for today. But as always, I'm joined by my fantastic co-host, Tim Silverwood. Tim, I am so excited to introduce everyone to James Bradley, the author of Deep Water, The World in the Ocean. This is a pretty incredible conversation you're about to have.
Oh, wow. This is a big one. When this book first came across the radar of the team at OIO, it sent proverbial ripples out there, and we knew we had to get our ears and our eyes around it. But it was actually one of our supporters. It was James Kirby, who I had an email in my inbox one day, and it was introducing me to James Bradley saying, Tim, I love the podcast. I just watched James speak at the Sydney Writers' Festival. You have to get him on the podcast. And lo and behold, from that introduction, we lined up the chat, and this episode is now for your listening pleasure.
There you go. It's funny how these things happen, and it's always so fantastic when it really comes from our, OIO family, right? Our fantastic community. And I would like to imagine that if we had an OIO book club, I think this book would be like the first one we cover. And what better decade for it to be released in than during the UN Decade of Ocean Science? What I really loved about this conversation as a creative myself was James saying that he'd actually tried to write it twice before, many years apart, but third time's a charm. And it feels like it's come out at perhaps one of the most perfect and also most pressing moments in time for the ocean and planet ocean globally.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a good time to talk about the ocean, right? Particularly, as you mentioned there, as advocates of this important messaging that we live on planet ocean. And the sooner we can start looking and making decisions about our future by incorporating the ocean and acknowledging the ocean. I mean, some of the huge stats that we talk about in this episode, 90% of the livable space on the planet we naively call planet Earth, 90% of that livable space is in the ocean. It's 95% of the biosphere is below the waves. So books like this have to reach the mainstream because suddenly people will appreciate that we cannot go continuing this exclusive relationship saying, oh no, we're humans, we control the terra firma, the land. We have to bring the ocean in. So this book just blows ocean literacy to the roof, right? This is exactly what we need to have, and it needs to make its way into the decision-making halls all around the planet. It is a simply fascinating book.
Yeah, it really is. And the conversation that you have with James is also just incredibly fascinating. For me, something that stuck out was this kind of real breadth of, I guess, emotion that's attached to it. Some of the words and phrases that the two of you used to describe the experience of reading the book were, I wrote these down. We've got fun, wonder, hope, awe, fascination, transformation, scale, and then tough things, crisis, state of play, serious, emergency. And I thought that these kind of phrases or keywords, if you will, were really interesting because that is essentially what the human relationship with the ocean is. It's the whole breadth, right, of human emotion from the good to the bad. And this book kind of covers all of that.
Yeah, and it's part history lesson. It's a whole chunk of just deep science and fascination, but then it's also posing all of the opportunities and the future when we do actually start to appreciate the ocean and change the way we treat it. So it's the most comprehensive book I've ever read about the ocean. I had to kind of cram it in a little bit before the podcast episode. So maybe my recommendation to people reading it would be to give yourself a little bit more time and make some of those notes throughout the way through because it really does cover a lot. And I just thoroughly loved it.
Yeah, so this is one that it feels like take some time. Maybe if you're a note taker, some people love to annotate their books, right? Crack out your highlighters, get a pen or a pencil and use those margins. and take your time, really digesting everything in it. It seems it's such a massive piece of work. Like, you touched on kind of the history aspect of it. Would it be fair to say that this is kind of a history of the ocean and our relationship with it?
Definitely, that forms a huge part of it, and some things, and it really starts to ramp up towards the end. Is that acknowledgement that the ocean enabled colonialism in a way, and this is something that, of course, I should have been alert to. Right, I live in a country that was invaded by a culture across the seas, but sort of realizing that the ocean is the kind of gateway to so much, and then it talks about the ramping up of capitalism and how new market opportunities emerged for countries like China to become the powerhouse of manufacturing the world over. That really rode on the back of shipping containers and the ability to then load a ginormous volume of stuff onto ships has changed the shape of the world in just a handful of decades. So reading this book realizes again, just the ocean is so central to not just the way the planet functions, but how we have used and abused the ocean for certain gains and for a hell of a lot of losses when it comes to things like culture.
100%. And one of the things in this conversation that I remember just made me go, "Oh, like you never think of that, right?" And kind of on the flip side of everything you just said, Tim, like, I guess in a slightly more inspirational light was this idea of the first humans to observe the tide and to work out what that is, what it means, eventually the science of how the tides work. You don't think about it because this information's out there for us now, but imagine the first people that kind of observed it, not knowing what it meant or what it was.
That's it. I mean, and the lessons that the ocean is dishing up are just happening daily, right? I mean, James spent a very, very, very long time researching this book and bringing all of this fascinating stuff to light. Yet, within the space of probably 6 months of it being published, there's a Nature article talking about the prevalence of dark oxygen, that these polymetallic nodules in the ocean are actually emitting enough current to generate oxygen, which then starts to pique the concerns of scientists that maybe some of the narratives that have been written around the formation of life on the planet might need to be re-examined. So it's just constant. The ocean is just dishing up story after story and little tidbit of information. But this book does give you a whole lot to put into your back pocket and take into your next dinner party conversation.
Wow. Yeah. Look, maybe this can inspire people to get their friends to. If you do have a book club, read the book, and maybe you go and you'd have a dinner party afterwards, right? Just to give yourselves the opportunity to actually have a conversation about what you've learnt, because maybe we don't do that as often as we should. And I think that's something that James seems to be pretty big on. Is like, let's talk about this.
I got an idea, Amelia. Podcast club. Share this around to someone else in your network, and the next time you're catching up, you can talk about the podcast and what you learn.
That's even better. I am 100% for that. Podcast club. I will immediately get onto the marketing for that. No, but everyone, seriously, that is the best way, to get this information around. Do share this with someone you think might be interested in it, and have those conversations. Talk to your friends, talk to your families, because that is how we're going to all together collectively help improve the health of the ocean. And you know what? I hope everyone really enjoys this conversation with James Bradley. James, thank you so much for giving us your time. And be sure to pick up a copy of Deep Water, The World in the Ocean. It should be available in all good bookstores or wherever you get your books. And I think we have Tim's wholehearted recommendation.
Yep, you got it. This is it's going to change the way you think and see the ocean, and hopefully just be another tool in our collective fight to get it recognized and to certainly change the way we treat it for the better for future generations. I'm so excited to have on the Ocean Impact podcast today James Bradley, who is the author of Deep Water, The World in the Ocean. And we are going to take all of you on an incredible journey to the deep, but also to our planet, our beautiful planet ocean. James, it's a real privilege to have you on the program. Thank you, and congrats on Deep Water. It is phenomenal. I'd love it if you could just start by explaining just a little bit about yourself and how you came to write such a significant book about the ocean and indeed about the perilous state of our planet.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So Deepwater is trying to kind of use the ocean as a lens to think about a whole series of questions about colonialism, about capitalism, about our relationship with the natural world, about how we think about our place in the scheme of things. And it's a book. I'm a novelist originally. I've been writing fiction for 30 years, I guess, and alongside that I've had this kind of career as a journalist. And over the last 10 or 15 years, I have been writing a lot more in the kind of environmental space around climate and animals and questions like that. But this book actually goes back a lot further. So it actually, I first started thinking about it almost 25 years ago. And I used to go surfing with my brother and some friends. We'd go a lot. We'd go body surfing. And I used to love that feeling of being out there in the kind of back break where you get that kind of movement of the swell. And I used to love that sense that when you're out there, you can feel a different kind of temporal scale around you. And I remember thinking, I want to write about this. I want to write a book which is about the ocean, which is about trying to use the ocean to think about time and the world and how it all fits together. And I tried to write it twice. In fact, back then about 25 years ago and also about 15 years ago, neither time could I make it work. And then I guess about 5 or 6 years ago, I still wanted to write it, and I guess I kind of came up with a structure that would let me do it. So I'm thinking about how to do it. But I think by the time I got there, it had become a book that was doing, I guess, a lot of other things. Like it wasn't just about some of those kind of big questions about kind of wonder and the scale of the world. It was very much about kind of climate breakdown, about environmental crisis, kind of where we are today and where we're heading.
So during that process then, when it was time, 25 years on, tell us about how did the book end up the way you initially intended when you sort of first started, or did it meander along the way? Tell us a little bit about how it came to be. I suppose really what I'm getting at here is, it starts to really pile on a bit towards the end there when you really start to lay down the state of play that we find ourselves in. Was it a little bit more towards that just journey of awe and that fascination and that history to begin with? Did you always expect it to kind of come on so strong towards the end?
I'm not sure that I did, and it's funny. The last maybe third of the book it's a lot, and I don't think I really understood that until I got to proofs and I read it in proofs, and I sat there going, oh, I need to kind of sit with. I know all this material, I've written it, but it was quite confronting seeing it all lined up like that. And I don't think that's not what the book is. Like, I think there's a lot of other things in it. I think there's a lot of, kind of fun and wonder and hope and all of those kinds of things as well. But, there are certainly some really tough things in it. And I guess when I was thinking about the book, because initially I wanted to write a book which I didn't want to write a book which had me at the center. So I didn't want to write a book that was me going on a journey. But the problem with trying to write about the ocean is that it's this kind of book about everything, essentially trying to write it. So you've got to have some kind of structural way of getting at that thing. And my way was, I thought, well, look, I'll write a series of essays was the original idea, and they will all kind of speak to each other across the book. And I guess I started out trying to do that. And then I realized quite quickly that wasn't going to work. That the book had to have a kind of intellectual structure. And there's actually quite a lot of structure kind of hidden in it that you probably don't notice, but it is kind of there holding it together. But what I did want was for people when they read it to, I think there's something we do when we go to the ocean. Like the ocean has an effect on us. And when we're near it, we feel our place in the world very differently. There's something about encountering the largeness of the ocean and, its scale, both in terms of space and in time. And I think it alters us. We feel different. We feel transformed by that. We feel more connected often. We feel a lot of those kind of structures that bind us kind of slipping away. And what I did want was people to have that kind of experience when they read the book, but also I wanted them to take on board where we are, the kind of scale of the crisis, but also see where it came from, and I guess have some kind of tools for thinking about where we go next. So it's not a downbeat book. Like I don't think it's a downbeat book at all. I think it's actually in its own way quite a hopeful book. But it's not one that is going to it's not a book that messes around about a series of things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it certainly does. And so much in the space that we occupy as an organisation and my passion area is this narrative that the ocean really does hold the solutions to so many of the planetary crises that we face. And so, to your points there, by looking at the planet through the lens of the ocean and taking us there, quite literally and metaphorically, we can really do a lot. And you talk a little bit about this idea that the ocean made us human. I wonder if you could sort of speak to that, this incredible role that the ocean has played in making us all human.
Yeah, well, and what you're saying is right. I mean, I think that one of the things that the ocean does is it gives us a way of thinking on a planetary scale. And that's one of the things that initially attracted me to writing about this, because I think trying to imagine the scale of where we are and the way everything fits together is incredibly difficult to do. But the ocean lets you think in that planetary sense and simultaneously demands that you think about continuity and interconnection and flow and the way things kind of move around each other. And I think learning to do those two things simultaneously is incredibly useful. But yeah, I mean, that idea that it made us human. So humans come out of Africa, and we kind of spread across the planet. And what you see with both earlier human species and with our species is that when we reach the water, we suddenly have to kind of cross it. We have to move, and you see so many of the kind of patterns of migration, relate to the ocean. So, to get into Australia, the ancestors of Indigenous Australians had to cross 100 kilometres of open sea. Even when, sea levels were at their lowest, there was a big, wide piece of ocean they had to cross to get here. And they did that over and over again, 100,000 years ago, 80,000 years ago. The date keeps moving back, but clearly a very long time ago. People got into North America by moving down what they call the kelp road. So they kind of went down past the ice sheets and down the coast of America into the Americas. So you have this sense that as we move out across the planet, the process of kind of learning to do those things, of kind of spreading across the planet, is something that kind of shapes us and changes us. And you also begin to see, some of the kind of activities that have, defined us as a species, but also have kind of shaped the planet. So you see us taking animals and plants with us when we go places, that kind of sense that we make our environment when we get there, and then we start trading and we start moving things around. And as you kind of move closer and closer to the present, you see the kind of origins of capitalism and of colonialism. They all take place on the ocean.
They do indeed. Let's talk a little bit about, we love talking about planet ocean to get people thinking back to that last point as to why, by looking at our situation through the lens of the ocean, we can hopefully turn things around. What are some of those facts that you dot throughout the book that really, people might be able to pick up and use to help explain to others in their community why we really need to understand that the ocean is everything on this planet?
Look, so the figure everyone always quotes is that the ocean is a bit over 2/3 of I think it's 71% of the planet's surface, which is huge. I mean, the Pacific Ocean is like 1/3 of the planet. But, there's a lot of water in there. They're also, on average, the average depth of that ocean is about just under 4 kilometres. So it's a huge amount of water down there. But it's also that, the ocean kind of drives, the water cycle on the planet, which keeps everything alive. So water kind of evaporates out of the ocean. It goes up into the clouds, it falls, it runs across the land, moves into our bodies and into plants, into animals, and flows out into the ocean. That happens again. There's a similar kind of process where the water goes down into the crust. It also is incredibly important in the carbon cycle, which kind of regulates carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, but also helps maintain the climate. It also maintains the climate in a kind of much more direct kind of way by the movement of the currents actually transports vast amounts of heat energy around the planet. So it moves heat kind of away from the tropics and further out. So the kind of the planet's kind of temperature is actually kind of managed by the ocean. But and in a more kind of recent context, something like 90% of the extra heat that humans have added to the planet have been absorbed by the ocean. So the ocean is the thing that's soaking up all of the energy that we're trapping in the atmosphere by pumping fossil fuels into it. So in a sense, the ocean both kind of regulates the planet. It has kind of shaped the planet, but it also kind of contains the future of the planet, because, that question about what happens to the ocean now, as it kind of absorbs this heat, is something that's incredibly important to all of us, to everything.
I remember picking up in one of the conversations you had, I think it was on the ABC, where you were asked the question about what happens to the ocean in the far, far future. I guess that's the sort of question around what happens to our planet in geology, in universal time. What happens to the ocean? And my follow-up question is going to be all around how it got here in the first place. So I'm really piling it on.
Oh, that's right. So what will happen with the oceans is that in about 1 billion years, as the sun kind of runs through its fuel, it will gradually grow bigger, and the planet will get hotter, and over time the oceans will be kind of will be kind of stripped away from the planet. They'll evaporate away. I'm not sure. I think there are different models about how exactly that happens, but essentially the planet will heat up and the oceans will go. But that's huge, impossibly distant in the future. It's 1 billion years plus in the future. The origin of the oceans is actually interesting because it's reasonably mysterious at one level. So, and this was actually one of the hardest bits of the book to write, because the science that I was writing about kept evolving while I was writing it. So if you'd asked someone 20 years ago, they would have said that when the Earth formed, it was too hot for there to be oceans, for there to be water, and that most of the water arrived later on meteorites and comets. It now looks like quite a lot of the water was here right from the start, and that there may have been oceans very, very early in the planet's history. In fact, the oldest rocks they've ever found are a kind of crystal, and they were found inside another rock that they found in the Jack Hills in Western Australia. And they are a kind of crystal that only forms near water, and they were created only a couple of 100 million years after the formation of the planet. So it looks like there was liquid water on the planet very, very, very early, which is fascinating. And it wouldn't have been a very clement planet. It would have been, the water would have been there because there was such high atmospheric pressure, and the temperature would have been 200 degrees or something. But yeah, so the oceans were there very early, they now think. They seem to have the water seems to have been in the rocks and the dust that formed the planet, and to have kind of emerged quite quickly, much quicker than I think they thought it did.
And indeed, there's water all throughout the universe and our solar system. I made that little remark before we started recording that I feel like the narrative, the message as a child growing up, when there was all that conversation about the chance of life in the solar system was, well, if there's water there, there's a good chance there's life there. But it turns out there's water everywhere.
Yeah. So what we now know is that there were oceans on Mars which were lost. We know that Venus was actually very much like Earth for the first few billion years of its life. And then there was a kind of runaway greenhouse effect, but there were oceans on Venus as well. We know that there are ice worlds all through the outer solar system. So there's moons everywhere out there, like Europa and Enceladus and Titan and maybe even Pluto, which seem to have liquid water. Well, what we know about them is because they have kind of icy surfaces, and then under several kilometers of ice there is water, and sometimes that water is hundreds of kilometers deep. Sometimes there's a rocky core down the middle, sometimes I think sometimes there isn't, but on some of those planets that water is a similar sort of temperature to the water in our oceans. It's salty. It's very much like the water here on Earth. And in fact, they're sending a couple of probes up there to look at it, because there's certainly several of them. So Enceladus, which is one of the moons, because it flexes and water kind of sprays out of it all the time, so they want to go in and test the water that comes out and see what's in it. But it seems like there's just water everywhere through the solar system, and that is fascinating because, as you say, what we've always thought is where there's water, there's life. Or maybe it's the other way around. There won't be life without water. But water seems to be everywhere. So the big question is, if we get to one of these moons and we find out there's life on them, that means life's probably all over the place. I mean, it may just be microbial life of some kind, but that will be big all on its own.
And that's where life here started, right? I mean, the diving into the deep and the realization of the pressure and the temperatures, but also the incredible life that's around hydrothermal vents and in these deepest parts of our own ocean. So it does extend a pretty good probability that it would be out there in other places.
Yeah, and that's a really exciting idea. The notion that life is something that might be everywhere I think it really affects our sense of our place in things. In a weird kind of way, you could look at the history of kind of thought in, I guess in kind of European and Western traditions, is this kind of constant displacement of humans from the center of the story. So 500 years ago, the Earth was 4,000 years old, and the sun went round the Earth, and we were the apex things. Then we realized that the sun doesn't go around the Earth goes around the sun. And then we realized that time is much larger than we think it is. The Earth is much older than we think it is. And eventually we reached this point where we realized that maybe even this life is just one part of a much larger story. So it's a kind of amazing process.
Another part of the book I really loved was when you're unpacking those stories of realization and discovery of some of the early scientists. And one was around the tides, and it just sort of made me realize how perplexing it must have been to previous civilizations to sort of look and ponder the ocean, the way it was moving, and then, of course, trying to predict those movements. And you really give a wonderful, summation of the discovery of something like the tides that we can now look up on our watches or our phones to see exactly what the tide is going to do. But that must have been a very difficult thing for a very long time.
Fascinating. I mean, human cultures have understood since, for as long as we've been human, I suspect, that they are connected to the phases of the moon. They get higher and they get lower, but they are different in different parts of the world. They, some places get huge tides, other places get small tides, and trying to work out how that happened was incredibly difficult. People had various kinds of theories. Eventually, they worked out that it was the moon, but essentially trying to kind of work out how to predict the tides is really, really difficult. And eventually, we've had the maths now for quite a long time. It's one of those classic kind of mathematical processes because essentially the tides are a kind of wave that kind of moves around the world. But like all waves, it kind of divides and it flows back. And so kind of analyzing it, you need to know what all of the components are. And there'll be things like resonances from land. There'll be, the interference of the sun. There'll be a whole range of very complex things. So it's one of those classic things where the maths at one level is quite simple, but the computations are incredibly complex. So you've got to have kind of computers to be able to do it. And you've got to have really accurate measurements. So one of the reasons that we can now predict the tide really effectively, and also a reason that we know that the United States did go to the moon, is that when one of the Apollo missions was up there, they left a little mirror on the surface of the moon, and NASA has been firing a laser at that for about the last 50 years, and that's given them incredibly accurate measurements of how far away the moon is, how it oscillates in its orbit. So we now have very accurate kind of moon data. Trying to understand it, it's a little like trying to analyze music. In fact, it's quite a lot like trying to analyze music. That process of kind of harmonic analysis they can do with music, where music is a kind of wave, but it'll be made up of lots of constituent waves, and the tides are like that. But it means that you get this kind of extraordinary movement of water around the planet. And when you think about it, it's so amazing. Like the notion that the water is being pulled up by the moon as it kind of moves around the planet. And it's not just the water. Like there's a thing called the crustal tide or the earth tide, and the actual planet deforms because of the moon. And you get this kind of, in places it rises by about 0.5 meter. And we can't feel it, of course. We can't detect it or see it, but it's there. Like the actual planet is deforming by about half a meter in some places as the moon pulls on it.
Another fascinating exploration of scientific discovery was around the lengths of days, something we all just probably take for granted. It feels so set, but of course it's not. Can you talk a little bit about that particular journey of discovery and understanding that days used to be a lot faster? Is that correct?
The Earth is gradually slowing down. Part of what it is the lunar month used to be much shorter because when the moon. So there's a planet called Theia that slams into the Earth a couple of hundred years, about 100 million years after it formed. So the Earth collided with another planet, and that kind of in one of a number of scenarios. I don't think they're entirely clear exactly how it happened, but essentially enough material was ejected from the planet and Theia ended up kind of inside the Earth. So in fact, there are chunks down under, I think, Madagascar that they now think are lumps of Theia that are just sitting down there under the planet. But the moon, all the material made the moon gets thrown off and makes the moon. But when it first formed, the moon was much, much closer to the Earth than it is now. I think it was about a quarter of the distance that it is now. And so it was huge in the sky and initially kind of molten and covered in volcanoes and things as well, which is kind of extraordinary. But it whizzed around the Earth really, really far. And that meant that I forget the figure, but I think at the beginning, the lunar month was only about 7 days or 10 days. It was really very short. It got longer and longer. And because you have a conservation of angular momentum, as the moon has slowly slowed down, it's drifted further away from the Earth. And so even back in the time of the dinosaurs, I think the lunar month was only about 22 days or something. And they can actually tell that by looking at the shells of some ammonites, which have they would create another chamber each month, and you'd have a kind of crenellation in the chamber for each day of growth. And when you look at them, they've only got 22 or 23 crenellations, whereas things like nautiluses now will have 28, 27 or 28 because they follow a lunar month, which is kind of mind-blowing. The notion that the kind of physical structure of the planet, the physical relationship with the moon, that's changed so much over time, I actually find it kind of extraordinary. I mean, that sense that these things that we said we think of as these set, timeless natures of our kind of planet are not, like they've been in flux, which is extraordinary. Sorry, a random detail I should have said before when I was talking about tides. I mean, they use computers to work that out now, but for a while they used what they call tide computers or tide machines, and they were essentially physical analog computers that you could kind of wind, and they had all of these levers and things so they could kind of use them to calculate the tides mechanically. And they've got a big one at Liverpool Museum in the UK, and that's the machine that they used to calculate the tides for D-Day, because you had to have very accurate tide charts to carry out that attack on Normandy. But yeah, these crazy things where essentially they're kind of machines that they could crank that would kind of predict the tides. Analog computers, basically,
So time machines, not really a thing. Tide machines, definitely a thing. You can go and see one.
You can go and see one. Yeah, it's just, I find all of that extraordinary as well.
Just bless the scientists. And I think just the incredible array of disciplines that people find themselves in, and then they dive deep and then they challenge themselves amongst their peer groups. And we are the recipients of this incredible insight. But that's probably a good segue to then talk about those wonderful 3 chapters, Migration, Echo, and Beings, where some of those insights into how organisms that are dependent on the ocean, how they live, they move, they interact, they communicate. I mean, we can talk about all the different things I've got listed down here, but you must have I'm guessing you would have really enjoyed those chapters. They are just rich in so many fascinating facts and insights.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, particularly the one about the stuff about both whales and fish I found incredibly exciting to both research and write about, and I think the whale stuff is probably less surprising to people because we kind of know whales are these highly intelligent, cultural, sophisticated animals. And we know that dolphins are fantastically intelligent. Dolphins, use sonar. They have essentially names in the form of signature whistles. But it was actually the stuff about fish, because I mean, I think that we don't think very much about fish. I mean, people, I think, both disregard they look at fish and they think they're stupid. They think that they don't have feelings. They think that they don't feel pain, and that's not right at all. Fish are highly intelligent, highly, social animals with complex social lives, and which on lots of the kinds of cognitive tests that we give to animals perform, better than dogs sometimes, as well as chimpanzees some of the time. They're very sophisticated animals, and I think we don't think about that enough. There's something about that kind of species gap. We find it reasonably easy to look at mammals, I think, and see sophistication in them. I think we find it much more difficult to look at fish and have that same response.
Yeah, we do. And I'd love to imagine a future state where we have bridged much more of that void, because they deserve it. But one of the things I'd love to go into is just how scientists discovered that some fish like groper sort of behave as in a way of pointing. This is a collaboration with eels. Could you explain a little bit about pointing fish?
Yeah, so work done by a guy called Ridwan Bashari, who is a scientist in Europe, and a young guy, in fact, called Alex Vale, who, in fact, grew up on the Lizard Island Research Station up on Great Barrier Reef. He's the son of the people who ran it for many, many years, and he grew up on the reef and became a scientist first and now works as a cameraman, and, in fact, worked on, I think, Planet Earth 2. He's worked on a number of those big documentaries, so he's done a lot of that kind of work. And Bashari was, I think, in the Red Sea, and he saw groper, and the groper were doing a thing where, so groper are good at catching fish in the open water, but they're not good at catching fish if they go into a hole. Eels are really good at catching fish if they go into holes. They're not so good at catching them in the open. But what was happening was the groper would go over to somewhere where they knew there was an eel. They'd alert the eel. The eel would swim out with them, and the two of them would swim off together. These two completely separate species of animals, and they would swim away across the reef together. And the groper would chase fish, and when the fish went into the holes, the moray would go and get them, And so you had this kind of thing where the two of them were working together to catch fish. But part of what was happening was that if the groper chased a fish and it went into the rocks, it would then perform this kind of dance where it would angle itself down with its nose pointing towards the thing was, and do this kind of shimmy in the water. And pointing is a really particular behavior. Like, almost no animals do it. Almost no animals, so even humans don't understand it until we're, I think, a couple of years old. But, I think some apes can do it. I think magpies might be able to do it. There's a very small group of animals that can do it. Dogs can learn to do it sometimes. They can learn to understand pointing. As anyone who's ever dealt with a dog knows that they're not very good with pointing. Cats can't do it, But they have a kind of test that they can apply, and it became quite clear that these fish were pointing. They were actually pointing, and the morays were understanding. And they've now worked out that this behaviour is spread across a whole bunch of different things. So lots of these different fish species will interact. There's ones that work with octopuses. There's ones that work with big humphead wrasse. They all do this. But this is really rare, this kind of cooperation between species. You don't get much of it on land at all, and you certainly don't get this kind of really sophisticated behaviour going on.
Yeah, and just remarkable again that scientists were able to observe and then test and then prove this kind of stuff. Gosh, there's so much more in these chapters. Fascinating to learn about elephant seals through, I suppose, the technological advancements around tracking devices and programs like IMOS. Tell us a little bit about what we can learn, not just about species behaviors, but a whole swathe of other insights into the state of the ocean through tracking systems like IMOS and particularly with those remarkable elephant seals.
Yeah. So IMOS is one of the kind of ocean monitoring systems, and it relies on a whole range of things. So they've got there's this thing called Argo floats. And so Argo floats basically they're all drifting around the ocean. I think several thousand of them, and they do this thing where they drop down to 100 meters and then drop down to 200 meters. They take measurements and they come back up. And there are floats, there are ships, there are all kinds of things. They all measure temperature and salinity and current and various things. So that's how we know what's going out in the ocean in a kind of macro sense. But one of the other things they use is what they call animal tracking, and it's run, in fact, a lot of it by a guy called Rob Harcourt, who's here in Sydney. And one of the things they do is they get elephant seals and other seals, and they stick kind of trackers that can measure temperature and measure salinity and do those kind of things to their head. And so what you do is you essentially instrumentalize the elephant seal. The seal becomes a kind of mobile laboratory, and then they swim out into the ocean, and you can kind of measure what they find. It gives you this kind of picture of it. And elephant seals are particularly good for this because elephant seals, they live at sea for about 10 months of the year. And when they're at sea, they mostly eat things that are down in the mesopelagic. So they kind of dive down several hundred meters and get things and then come back up. So these big dives all the time. And so what happens is they essentially glue these things to their heads, and the elephant seals go out and gather all of this data. And, that's incredibly useful because it tells us information about what's under the ice. We've got some information from deep down in the ocean. But it's been really important to, in fact, the climate ocean state models. I think the argument is it's improved the ocean state models, the data got from the animals by about 10 or 15%. The accuracy of them has been improved because we've got all of this data that we wouldn't have been able to get otherwise from down in kind of Antarctic waters.
Thank you, elephant seals. Yeah.
Thank you. And the thing that worried me is, does it worry the seals? And they say, no, we don't think it worries the seals, but they drop off after about 6 months or something anyway. So they lose the devices anyway, but they literally glue them to their heads. Apparently they use the same glue that they use, when they stick cat's eyes and things on the road.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently it's the same. It's like the industrial glue. And there's a guy who works for the Antarctic division, and he apparently he's the guy who goes and catches the seals and puts them on. I actually haven't met him, but I met his ex-girlfriend who was telling me that she used to go out with the guy who stuck the things on the seals' heads.
That's a conversation starter. And you could go on to say, I think some of the deepest levels that were recorded were over 2,300 meters the elephant seals were going down to. And, they would have had to redesign the trackers, right? Because the pressure that you were going to get down there would crush anything.
Yeah, so when they were first tracking elephant seals, everyone thought they only went down a couple of hundred meters. And what they were doing was they're putting these trackers on them, and then the trackers would get destroyed. And they thought what was happening was the seals were rolling them on them or something. But what was actually happening was the seals were diving, 1,000 meters, 1,500 meters, 1,800 meters down into the water, down into the dark, basically. And the pressure was just destroying the things. They had to build trackers that were strong enough to cope with it. And they stick them on other things as well. They stick them on penguins. They stick them on other kinds of seal. I think they stick them on Weddell seals as well. But it's a really interesting kind of technology because it gives them information that we wouldn't be otherwise able to get. And the other thing it's been used to do is to work out where it kind of tells you a lot of things about the behavior of the animals as well. So it's quite an interesting kind of project, I think, and a very successful one, I think. So getting information about the ocean is difficult. It's enormous. It's very deep, and you can't scan it. And interesting, I wrote something which actually isn't in the book, which is about the Newston, which is the kind of floating ecology that floats on the surface of the ocean. So things ranging from blue bottles to there's a kind of sea anemone that's retooled its foot so that it can float from the top of the ocean. There are kinds of seashells, sea snails, which produce kind of bubble rafts that they float underneath, and they all drift on the surface. But knowing about that, they have to use kind of citizen science because there's so much ocean, you can't go out there and study it. So these kind of using these kind of floating and moving things is one of the ways we learn about this enormous space.
Gosh. Yes, there's probably still so much to learn, but yeah, as I said, those few chapters are just jam packed with mind blowing facts about what we do know. Mentioning, going deep, you do meet some really interesting people in the process of writing the book who choose to personally go to very deep places in the ocean. Tell us about the very deepest parts of the ocean and the kind of crazy people that you've met who have actually gone there.
Yeah, so one of the people I spent a lot of time with when I was working on the book was a man called Alan Jameson. And Alan is a Scot originally. He is one of the real experts on the deep ocean, and he's now at UWA in Perth. And he started, interestingly, in kind of oil and gas, working in Aberdeen, and he was working on making platforms, things, all of that technology they use with oil and gas. We've got to have things that go down on water. And it occurred to him, I guess, 15 or 20 years ago, that we had all these things that went down to about 3,000 meters, but nothing that went down really deep. So he started designing what he called Hadal landers, and they were essentially machines you could drop off ships that would sink right down to the bottom of the deepest points in the ocean. So, 8, 10, 11 kilometers below the surface down in the trenches. And then they would, they could take video and do things like that. And he became a kind of expert on the deep sea. There's not very many people who work in that space. And Alan was the scientific advisor on the Five Deeps mission. And the Five Deeps mission was a thing set up by a guy called Victor Vescovo, who's an American explorer. And Vescovo built a submersible and equipped a ship, basically. And the idea was they were going to go out and go to the deepest point in every single ocean. And that meant going down to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, the bottom of the Java Trench, the bottom of the kind of Puerto Rico Trench. And that kind of process meant that, Alan kind of went along because it would allow him to do science at the same time. He could kind of study what was down there. And so they found out all kinds of really amazing things. They found fish deeper than they thought they were going to be. They found shrimp deeper than they thought they were going to be. But what they did find was you get down to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, which is like 11 kilometers below the surface. And, there's life down there. There's amphipods. There's all kinds of things living down there in this, really very extreme environment. It's not just about the pressure. It's about, the temperature. It's very cold down there. And there's almost no nutrition, so there's no photosynthesis down there. The only food there has to drift down from above, and she told me a wonderful story about when you get kind of things falling down, amphipods come in to eat them, and they do it with sound, basically. So they hear each other scuttling towards it, and they all go shooting off to eat the thing that's come down. But yeah, and I think the thing that you see once you're looking at those deep ocean environments is we think of them as being very separate to us. We kind of imagine them as this kind of alien place, but they're not. They are intimately connected with the rest of the planet. The currents flow through them. Food moves down, things move up, and trash ends up in them. So there's plastics down there. They found nuclear waste from Fukushima down there. They found, all of our mess drifts down there. And there is something about us needing to recognize that deep ocean is not separate to us. It is part of the world. It is as, we are as connected to it as any other part of the ocean. And, that kind of, maybe we'll talk about deep sea mining in a minute, but that kind of goes back to this deep sea mining thing as well, this kind of notion that you can just go down there and dredge things off the bottom and it won't matter. These are environments, they're complex, sophisticated environments, and, we damage them. The kind of extraction that we do with them damages them in profound ways.
Yeah, that's right. It does sound like everything down there is it's got the slow-mo button on, right? Everything is very, very like deep space, deep time down there, and then part of those is these nodules that I think you mentioned that some of them can only grow 1 to 2 millimeters in a million years. These highly prized nuggets of goodness that now are being touted as a bit of a part of the rescue plan to help us electrify the future. But as we've seen with so much of colonialism and the rush for resources with no consideration of the consequences, we all have an incredible duty, don't we, to make sure due process is undertook before any attempts are made to go down there and mine these resources.
Yeah, so there was a study a couple of years ago which tried to look at these questions, and what it kind of concluded was that we don't even know enough about these environments down there to make to do a kind of cost benefit or a risk analysis of what mining the seafloor would do. I mean, essentially what you've got is a situation where about 2/3 of the ocean, so about half the planet's surface, is what they call abyssal plain. So it's essentially flat, featureless, very deep water, so it's 4, 6, 7 kilometers deep. And life moves very slowly down there. Because there's not much energy, life is very spread out. But what will happen is you'll get bones or something will drift down from the top, and the minerals in the water will actually, over really long periods of time, kind of collect on it. And eventually you get these nodules growing down there, and they're rich in lithium and cobalt, in cobalt, in nickel, in a number of things that we desperately need to kind of transition to a low carbon economy. So there's this kind of argument that it's a green thing to do to go down there and mine this, because what you're doing is you're helping slow down, you're helping this kind of transition, you're helping the kind of green transition by getting that stuff. But it's exactly like every other resource scramble. Essentially we've got people pushing to do this before we really understand what the risks are. The scientists all seem to be pretty clear that the damage is really great, and that, as I say, there's studies now showing that we don't even understand. Every time we go down there and they bring up things from the bottom, 70% of them are species we've never seen before. I mean, how can we say that we understand what's going to happen to an environment if we go down there and start digging these things up?
So what do we do to prevent this from happening and repeating so many of the mistakes that we've made in the past? I mean, obviously there's lots being done, lots of large organizations leading very strong campaigns to try and mobilize communities. But, what do we do about, international politics of it, corporate inputs? What are your thoughts on what needs to happen to avert potential catastrophe?
Look, I think a lot of really important stuff's already gone on in that space. I think there's been some really good stuff around kind of corporate responsibility. I think that the environmental organizations have been very strong on it. I think a number of governments are now being quite strong on it. But it is a difficult area. So there's a couple of things I'd say, which are things I kind of try and think through a bit in the book. One is that at the moment, most of our cobalt comes from the Congo, and what goes on there is horrific. The way that the cobalt is mined, the kind of human cost of it, the environment. And I don't think that you can have a single-pronged approach to this. I mean, we need to try and not be doing this to the ocean, but we also need to be thinking about what do we do to make sure that the way that these metals are being extracted on land in the countries where it's coming from don't have those human and environmental costs. But I also think that you need strong international regulation around this, but you also need to think about how much of this do we really need, and what you're already seeing is that battery technologies are changing. The amount of these things that we need is dropping quite fast. The estimates seem to be that the terrestrial reserves are probably enough at the moment. They're all kind of moving around a bit, but it's also about how do we transition. So there's a really fascinating detail in the latest IPCC report where lots of these things about how much cobalt do we need to build kind of electric cars depend on us building enormous cars like we drive now. But if what we do is we transition to more public transport, small electronic vehicles like bikes and things like that, it's enormously cheaper in terms of those materials. So there's a kind of thing about, we can actually think about what the kind of uses of these things are, as well as thinking about how do we regulate the ocean stuff back there, if that makes sense. So there's kind of a number of different tranches, I think, to that kind of question.
That's right. I mean, there's one path which is continuing on a similar trajectory with the same sort of expectations on how we live and how we do things, and that could put a very strong argument down. I think you sort of even mentioned, to get to this low carbon future, to meet net zero, we may need 6 times the current rare earth mining, but that's a trajectory that potentially can be altered. Like if we do have this restructure, if that becomes the economic model of the future, that we actually adjust that a few degrees, then suddenly those predictions can be well off the mark.
Yeah, and so absolutely, and the figures in the IPCC report about, transport particularly are really very striking. A strengthening of public transport systems and not just replicating a car fleet like we have now, will reduce the demand for a number of those metals enormously. But also, you're seeing a lot of improvement in battery technologies, and you're seeing, kind of a lot of steps towards much better recycling and reuse of these things. And you actually see, if you look at the materials that the people who want to do the deep sea mining do produce, is one of the things they say is we only need to do this for a little while, because then we'll have enough in the kind of system and we can keep recycling it. But, we actually probably have enough in the system anyway. I mean, if you look at the IEA reports, they seem to think that there's enough. There will be enough. So there's a kind of real argument about whether we need to do it in the first place. And, I would be the first to say that I think I actually found all of this stuff quite difficult to write about, because one of these things where you have claim and counterclaim and people just don't even seem to be on the same page, and trying to kind of work out which set of figures you were hearing quoted was right is often quite hard. But I mean, I think that if you stick with the figures from the IEA and some of those organisations, they make it seem like we probably don't even need to do it. It's not even a question about whether we should do it. We don't even need to do it, quite possibly.
Yeah, and then I guess the other claims that the romanticising of the ways that it can be done, that of course, we can do it in a way that won't cause harm. I mean, they don't have the science to back that up anyway. They don't have the baseline. But, I think your book, and towards the end, you really do start to really lay down that, sort of history doesn't lie on this stuff. And the impacts that you've just illustrated throughout the book, they're just harbingers of what's to come unless we radically change our ways. So as we sort of get to the tail end of this great conversation, maybe just a bit of a summation from you around, what you did learn as part of this incredible journey in writing the book, and what you really think we need to be doing in order to alter that terrible trajectory that we find ourselves on.
Yeah, and we are on a really terrifying trajectory. I mean, I think that we, in terms of global heating, we're on track at the moment for, 2.5, more than 2.5, which is just absolutely terrifying, But, if you want to look for the positive message in that, 15, 20 years ago, we were on track for 4 degrees, so we have bent that curve already. And I think that's a really important thing to understand. I think that we are heading into a very scary period, it's going to be 20, 30, 40 years. It's going to be a really frightening time, but the way that we come through that is by, we get carbon emissions down, we get the kind of extractive processes that we're using under control. We reduce consumption. We move to a kind of more sustainable economic model. But that move to a more sustainable economic model is also about a move to a kind of fairer world, and that's a world where resources are distributed more evenly. And I think that one of the things that's happened to us is we live in a society where people find it very difficult to imagine alternatives. Like, the world as it is kind of, Mark Fisher, who's a Marxist writer who killed himself, in fact, about 10 years ago, but he has this great line about kind of capitalism occupying all the space to the horizon, and so we find it difficult to imagine the kind of transition, how do we move to a different kind of world? How do we move to a different economy? But what we have is a history that shows us that happens, So just sort of go back. So what we get into is a thing where we think about kind of the only thing we think of, it's kind of collapse. But history shows us that's not what happens. History shows us that societies change. As the conditions change, societies evolve and change, and ours is doing that now. You can see it kind of happening. You can see it with the exponential growth in renewable energy. You can see it with the rapid increase in, kind of technology around all of these things. And you can see it in, as well, I think, kind of the development of a series of international structures designed to, kind of protect the environment, and that's these things like the Paris Agreement and things like that, but it's also things like the High Seas Biodiversity Treaty, which just went through last year. So I remember about 10 years ago, I spoke to Daniel Pauly, the fisheries scientist, and he's been arguing for years that what we need to do is to lock the high seas up from fishing. So if what we do is we ban fishing on the high seas, that will increase the number of fish in coastal waters. There will actually be more, catches will actually go up if we do that. And I remember thinking, that's mad. No one's ever going to do that. That's just a kind of pie in the sky sort of idea. We now have this. We now have international agreements in place to lock up 30% of the high seas by 2030, protected from fishing. And that you can actually see those changes beginning to happen. We're at a point where carbon emissions, we were talking about this before we started, carbon emissions look like they've peaked. Like we're right there at the top now. It's too late. They're still too high. I mean, all of that, but they are peaking. And that means that the next thing is they start to go down. And once they start to go down, that curve will accelerate as well. So maybe you're saying at the beginning, we're heading for 2.5 degrees of warming. Maybe in 10 years' time, we'll be heading for 2. Do you know what I mean? Like that's that, so terrifying as things are here, you can see that stuff all happening on the other side. You can actually see the change beginning to come.
Yes, and it does lend itself to that incredible frustration in that the science has been barking on about this stuff for such a long time, and that so much of the devastation could have been averted, but alas, we will strive on. That's sort of just question there, I guess, around you met such a diversity of people with such a diversity of emotional responses, I suppose, to the situation that we're in. We don't probably need to go into too much about how others have felt, but you personally, how do you sort of cope? And I suppose from our side, like, I think I mentioned this to you prior, like I'm part of my journey as an environmentalist, and why I'm sort of here and have a stable mental health with Ocean Impact Organisation is we're surrounded by this optimistic sense of can-do attitude with solutions that are just desperate to scale and have their greatest impact. And it's worked for me, but of course there's many out there who have seen, have witnessed, have predicted so much, and it's almost worse than what they were predicting. So yeah, what's been your process of interpreting the state of play, and what do you sort of adopt as an approach to deal with some of that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that one of the things I found quite interesting when I was working on the book is lots of the scientists are, I think they find it really difficult. You talk to coral scientists, they're focused on doing things. They're focused on trying to find some way of doing it. But, it's a really difficult space, I think, emotionally to work. I think I'd say a couple of things. One is that I think, like a lot of people, you lurch every day between this sense of kind of absolute horror at the world and at what's going on, but also kind of a sense of the kind of beauty and wonder of it. So you have this kind of parallel thing happening, which is, you see such beauty, but then you're aware of so much kind of loss and pain, and then that's kind of sitting simultaneously. I think for me, writing the book, I said before, I think it's made me both kind of more optimistic, or both more pessimistic and more optimistic simultaneously. I think that you spend a lot of time in this space, you read about it, you have a really granular sense of how bad the damage is, how far down the kind of rabbit hole we are. But simultaneously, enough to put a bottom on that kind of despair. Okay, so it's bad, but it's not as bad as those people say. Do you know what I mean? And also these good things are happening, and you can see that there are roots through the thing. And I think for me, I try and keep an eye on that. I have 2 kids. I don't think despair is an option. I also don't think despair is an ethical option. I think that we have a kind of obligation to invest in the future, to kind of care about the future, and to kind of want to make a better one happen. And that comes about because we do the things that need to be done. You keep pushing to get the things that need to be done. You do the thing that you can do will help, if that makes sense. And in my case, I worry all the time about whether writing books and writing articles and things is the best thing I could be doing with my time. But, it feels like something, the best thing that will make you feel better is doing something. I think that is a difficult process. I actually think that one of the things that you have to learn to do is to be open to what's going on. I actually say that in the book. You need to find a kind of emotional state where you accept both the pain and the beauty, and that's that can be quite difficult. But it's the place you want to live, because you're doing things that the service of not looking away, but also of not giving up on them, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I do. few things there, like, doing nothing is not an option, and that's certainly a response that I think a number of scientists you met share. Knowledge is power, right? And I think about the books I've encountered throughout my life and my career, and a book can set a new benchmark, and it can also really, really light a fire. And I'm thinking of all the leaders of tomorrow and the people of influence now, the people that can alter their own trajectory to lean into these challenges as a result of books like yours and others. So I thank you for writing the book, for persevering over 25 years. I thank you for your time on this podcast, and I thank everyone who endured our conversation.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. It was great. I really enjoyed it.